It's tabletop time, I'm Dave, and today I'm going to be bringing you something very close to our hearts. We're finally announcing and painting and building some world for our latest Gate Crash character. And also I'm going to be bringing you more information about where you can get Bone Harvester and what's happening with Gate Crash. But the bulk of this video is going to be building and painting the coolest bony bone domain I possibly can, and I'm just going to get right into it.
So I've brought into the recording room the wonderful Jen.
Hi, it's DJ Jen.
This is, of course, the gorgeous pre-supported Bone Harvester model, which is available today for the first time.
I believe around the studio we call him Bony Boy.
Bony Boy does often get thrown around, that is for sure. This model printed in one piece with a hot water bath. These supports just peel right off it. It's perfect.
That's some good peelies. I thought you were making a model. Why are you making some potatoes and wrapping them in tinfoil?
Well, you see, I've been playing with cosplay sculpting and I knew a little bit about Bone Harvester's lore. I'm going to tell you a bit about that later in the video. But for now, just know that I need to sculpt a skull throne. This is going to be the skull of a giant serpent or a dragon. Rather than wasting a whole bunch of clay, I'm using tinfoil to just bulk out the frame.
Cool, really good idea.
This is pretty standard modeling practice. Now, the throne will be mounted on the top of this skull, and I just want to make sure I'm checking the scale of Bone Harvester with the scale of the skull I want to make. And at this stage, I decide that this very long alligatory snout is not quite big enough, and I'm going to bulk it out with some more aluminium foil.
Say aluminum.
Aluminium.
I love that!
Now, this big bony boy bone skull throne is going to have some horns, and to make horns have something to hold on to, I used some armature wire and just sort of stabbed it into the frame and then coiled it around to give it some strength. With the basic skull armature built, it was time for me to use the forbidden pasta roller to make a whole bunch of cosclay mixed together smoothly. I actually found the automated part of this rather than having to use the hand crank a lot easier.
Your fingers getting very close to it make me very, very nervous.
That's alright, don't worry, it isn't spinning that hard and it certainly isn't that strong. It's not gonna suck me into it.
Okay. We don't want fettuccine fingers here.
With the linguine strips rolled out, I could clad the armature that I'd already made, effectively creating a skin of the cosclay and then wrapping all of the areas I would be sculpting later. This saves just a lot of clay.
That isn't creepy at all. It really does look like skin, this cosplay. It's really weird.
One thing I did know is that skulls often have a lot of holes through them, like nasal cavities, areas where, brains and soft tissue goes. So to make sense of that very comical or cartoony shape, you'll see here that I use a thick strip of the cosclay to basically bridge the gap between the top of the skull and the front of the skull. This way I've got a hole that goes all the way through, and that'll make sense later as well. Broadly here, I just use some tools and plenty of Vaseline, which I find makes the experience of sculpting much easier, to roughly shape out the anatomy of this fictional serpentine skull. I don't know if it's a dragon or a giant serpent, leviathan, crocodile. Either way, is snappy, big, and made up.
And very cool.
Thanks, Jen.
Now I see here that you might be adding some wormy dealies.
Wormy dealies? That's trademark terminology. All right, we're gonna call them eye slugs.
Yeah, perfect.
Sick. So we're chucking some clay slugs on this, and I'm just sculpting this in. This is basically building the personality of the skull. I'm creating the brow ridges, the eye sockets, really bulking everything out. And I'm going to continue to use these sculpting methods to just shape out the rest of the skull. Now, why a giant skull? Well, it's because the character of Bone Harvester has actually made a throne of bones from all the champions of his world that have tried to challenge him, killing them and taking their skulls as trophies.
Kind of like the Game of Thrones throne, but skulls instead.
Yeah, instead of swords, it's skulls. I mean, he's a bone harvester, not a sword harvester.
Metal.
No, that would be the throne from Game of Thrones. This is bone, Jen. So broadly, the giant skull, of course, is the largest apex predator of his world that he hunted and killed. Now, after sculpting the skull itself, I wanted to sculpt a whole bunch of smaller bones to build up this skull. So I just used spare bits of cosclay, making individual vertebrae to glue together to create spines, as well as some more classic humerus bones, femurs, and the like. Another area that I built out is bones such as ribs, which were pretty easy to do. I just made little snaky shapes and then curled them around. These all got taken home to set in the oven. To make the throne itself, I wanted to use a different putty. I knew I'd be adding a whole bunch of plastic skulls, so I didn't want to be oven baking this. So instead I went with Milliput, as it is a lot quicker setting. Immediately after using the Milliput, I remembered how much I preferred cosclay. Yeah, next time I'll find a different way of doing this. Either way, I built the shape of the chair out of Milliput around some tin foil or aluminium foil in much the same way as I had the skull. Once this was very roughly shaped out into an appropriately sized chair, I started grabbing a whole bunch of skulls and shoving them into the mill apart while it was still setting. Now, it wasn't only the skulls that I started to stick in, I also included those bones that I had sculpted yesterday. And to make the skulls stretch even further, I often grabbed the clippers and cut a lot of them in half at different angles, so I could have different parts of the skull protruding all over this throne at different angles.
Do you love bones? Do you want to put more bones on your bones so you can have a bone man? Who doesn't? And that's why Bone Harvester is available for the first time for sale on Tabletop Time's brand new and updated website. Not only is Bone Harvester available, but all of our previous 3D models will be available on the website too, as well as direct access to our merch. We've actually changed merch providers from Teespring to ensure a higher quality product for everyone. We're really happy with the new provider, and I think you will be too. We've also added aprons, which is kind of fun. The sales of the previous Gatecrash models have really helped us continue to actively develop Gatecrash. And I want to talk a little bit more about that later in the video, but for now, just know that every purchase of Bone Harvester goes directly towards funding the development and design of new characters for the game, and just cool new models for you to print. To celebrate the new store, it is 10% off absolutely everything. Make sure you go to the Tabletop Time website, links in the description, or just type in it's tabletoptime.com. We really appreciate your support, and we hope you enjoy the new fancy layout. Thank you all, and bye.
With all the sculpting done, it was time to get practical with some classic cheap scratch building materials. That means matchsticks and popsicle sticks.
I don't know if you've realized this or not, but you've used a lot of natural materials when it comes to this build. There's no like man-made fibers, it's all natural, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah, I feel like Bone Harvester has kind of eschewed the benefits of civilization, and he's quite happy using what he can find out in the wilderness to build his throne of skulls. Thorn would be proud. There's just way too little blood though. So with these popsicle sticks, I actually scored a whole bunch of grooves into them to accentuate a wooden texture and snapped them roughly at the edges to make them look like they were roughly hewn as opposed to being made at a professional lumberyard. I then created a frame for the bottom of the chair and glued it into place, so Bone Harvester would be able to climb up the nose of the skull and then sit in the throne atop it, between the horns. To add a sense of structure to the chair, what might actually help hold it together, I used some balsa wood. Grabbing that balsa wood, I broke it into roughly shaped planks and scored it with a sculpting tool. I also made sure to really rough up the ends to make it look like this wood was rotting over time and breaking as nature took claim. With these pieces hewn out, I began to glue them around the parts of the chair that I hadn't yet filled with skulls, especially on the back and sides to give a bit of a framing and a sense of something holding the chair together. Another touch I wanted to add was some wooden planks going up the nose of the animal that Bone Harvester would walk up. I secured some matchsticks to act as supports, and with this done, all the woodwork was finished. But with the woodwork finished, it was time to bring in some string.
String, you say?
Yes, continuing my theme of natural fibers, I used superglue and string to just add another element of support to this structure to make it look a little bit more realistic and lived in.
I've used this twine before and I actually really like it. It's got these fibers that come off of it that make it look really natural.
My personal favorite part of my twine usage was where I secured the second board to that nose area that I'd previously sculpted to have a gap in it. So I actually pushed the rope underneath and tied it around, so this quite naturally is tied onto the bone in a way that could be replicated in real life if you had a giant dragon skull.
Just one casually lying around.
So I'm super happy with how this has turned out. I definitely feel like I went above and beyond in sculpting this. It was pretty fun. It was a little adventure in trying new things and using a whole bunch of different materials. Now I have to paint it. The thing with painting bone is it can be easy to make it very samey. So I'm actually going to take a leaf out of Murray's book and use a whole bunch of different colored undersprays to develop some interesting tones. Wow, the wind.
Painting the scenery was actually a breeze. After I'd done those underspray colors that give a bunch of tones to it, I could dry brush in some khaki and then a highlight of bone. The wooden areas I dry brushed in a warmer tan, and on the ground I also used the dry brush to bring in olive green and a more rich green. Bone Harvester's world is actually a lush jungle, so it's really important to show that through the paint undertones before we put flock on. This was the perfect project for Gamer's Grass laser cut plants, which I already absolutely adore, but I could use a bunch more of them here, especially the bracken. Now originally I was going to do another bone jutting out of the eye of this dragon. However, I felt that it didn't really fit once I actually got the sculpt together. So instead I curled the armature down and around, and I'm going to turn it into a bit of a tropical vine, populating the area with a variety of these foresty laser cut plants. I then brought in a couple of large shrubs from Gamer's Grass of different colors as well, just to again bush everything up.
I couldn't help but think it looked like this really cool part of an aquarium, like something you'd buy for your fish or your lizard, but in a really cool way. I'd be proud to own this.
Thank you, Jen. I'm glad you're likening my beautiful creation to an aquarium toy. Finishing out the base of the diorama, I used PVA glue and Woodland Scenics flocks to put in a whole bunch of different colors, shapes, and textures of them, and make the ground of the jungle really feel like some undergrowth. I also used finally some Gamer's Grass moss tufts and had them growing in patches over this ancient skull. But now I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you all a bit about Bone Harvester before we get down to painting him.
A while ago, we announced Gatecrash, that we were developing a game, and we got some hot responses, should we say. There was a lot of contention about whether or not we should be trying to integrate an app and a tabletop game. One of the changes we've been making moving forward is actually taking that concept and separating it. We're actually going to be developing the world of Gatecrash games through a few different lenses. Through different avenues, we're seeking funding to develop a app-based game, and we're also going to be developing tabletop exclusive, tabletop only ways to play. But we did want to say thank you for all of your earnest feedback and that we have taken it on board. But for now, I did want to share a little bit about today's character, the brand new character, Bone Harvester. Bone Harvester's story is one that I developed personally, and I love him. I have a bit of an attachment. So Bone Harvester originated on a tropical forest world, and he was the captain of a king's guard, a mighty barbarian warrior who was rumored to be able to fell anyone who would oppose him. Not only was he a mighty champion, but also a peerless commander. And at the end of many a long season of campaigning, several years persecuting the enemies of his king, he returned home to find hostility. The royal guards of the kingdom openly attacking him and his retinue on sight. Assuming they would return victorious champions, they had returned somehow enemies. But the man who would go on to become Bone Harvester would not take that lightly. Through a grueling battle, he fought his way through the guards and into the very throne room of the king he had served for many years, only to find that this king had taken for himself his wife and his child. Seeing his own child run in fear of him, his wife clinging to another man, and the king who he'd served his life cowardly hiding from him, he snapped. And so began the legend of the monster that would become known as Bone Harvester. You can actually see on the miniature the outcome of that little dispute. The skull of the king sits atop his weapon as a constant reminder to always know the mind of your enemy. The heart of his wife is clutched within the center of his ribcage, so it can never belong to another. And finally, as a necklace, you'll see a very small pair of legs, so no child of his can ever run from him again. Yes, Bone Harvester is not a good character. This monster is from the faction Omega, and they are mortals or once mortals who serve the god of death and endings. Bone Harvester has gone on to prove himself immortal and a peerless champion of one-on-one combat, slaying any enemy who would dare stand against him and taking a single bone from them. This bone he would then incorporate into himself, becoming a golem of perfection in his eyes. Bone Harvester seeks an end to all things, as do all servants of Omega. He seeks an end so no one can ever know betrayal in the way that he did, pain in the way he did, suffering in the way he did. And his fractured mind thinks killing everyone else is the best way to go about getting this. There's loads more lore to Bone Harvester, and it goes a lot deeper than that. But I thought I'd give you all the surface level explanation of the character, because I think it's really cool. This is just one sample of the lore we're building for all the characters and worlds of Gatecrash, and we're really excited for them. So if you'd love to support the development of these characters and this world, please consider picking up the Bone Harvester model STL for yourself on the website. This mini is exclusively hosted on the website and has 10% off to celebrate its launch. So check it out at itstabletoptime.com. Well, I'm really happy with that all turned out, and thank you those 35% of you who've stuck around to this part of the video. It was super fun hand sculpting a whole bunch of things and continuing to learn more about using cosplay and various sculpting mediums. I think it turned out really cool, but what do you all think? And do you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see next? A reminder that there is 10% off absolutely everything on the Tabletop Time website. That's itstabletoptime.com. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe and share with your friends, and we'll see you in the next one in like 2 or 3 days.